So lately, I've been watching a lot of videos on how to make cool special effects in my game. And I don't know about you, but when I follow along these videos, their screens are looking super cool with a lot of cool effects happening, and mine, it doesn't look the same. And I spend a lot of time trying to figure out why mine does not look as cool as theirs does. So today I'm going to go over some of the things that I've learned on maybe some of the steps that they do not show you ahead of time, maybe because they assume that you're doing what they're doing. So there's a couple things that are key to getting your objects and your effects looking good. And one of those is that glow effect that you see on an object. And a lot of effects use this glow effect, sometimes called bloom. And I'll show you how to get your objects to bloom and go a little bit on the particle system, because getting particles to bloom is a little bit more complicated. Getting a basic object to bloom is pretty straightforward. And I'll get a little bit into pipelines, because pipelines are key to getting some of the effects looking the way they do. And dive a little bit into how to make some glowing particles that kind of look so cool. So let's put on our programming glasses and dive right into Unity. So to start out with, in figuring out how to make things glow, and in this case we're going to work on glowing particles, is that we have to understand that there's a difference between the pipelines we are using. So when I'm making a new project, and this is, as you can see, Unity 2020, we have an option of what we should start as our template. And we have 3D Core, we have HDRP and URP. So what's the difference between these? Well, 3D Core does not support certain pieces of functionality that Universal Pipeline supports. And one of those things is glowing. So if you are using a project without Universal Render Pipeline, you cannot make any objects glow. Now the HDRP is a additional install, and I installed that package when I was looking at some other options, VFX specifically. VFX, graphs, and effects will only work on high definition render pipeline, and high definition render pipeline does not support mobile. It runs on the GPU and requires a fairly substantial GPU and only will work on a desktop computer. So if you're going to make a mobile game, you can't use HDRP, which means you can't use VFX graphics. So if you're looking at some tutorials that use VFX and they look really cool and you want to make a mobile game, those two just don't go together. Universal Render Pipeline does support mobile, and so you can do some of the cool effects, including shader graphs. And that's something newer that they added. Can't remember if it's 2019 that they added shader graph, which is just a UI on front of their shader creation files, which can be quite complicated in order to use. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm just getting into it. So I'm just going to be going over the basics here. If you really want to see some super cool effects with shader graphs, there's lots of videos out there. I'm here to explain the basics. That if you've watched some of those videos and you're confused because you just can't figure out how to make the basics work, that's what I'm going to kind of be going over today. So what I did is I created a Universal Render Pipeline project. And I'm going to cancel because I already have the project up and running. So we will open that up. So what I've done is I have the basic project, and I didn't delete all the sample. There's lots and lots of sample assets in here, and I didn't delete them. They're still around. You can delete them, obviously, and clear them all out to create an empty project for yourself to start with. So let's go in, and I have just a basic plane, and I used one of the sample materials there for the plane, and I'm going to create a cube. Choose a nice cube, and I have set up some materials. So I have this red solid glow material, and what I've done is I've set an emission color, and when we look at that color, we can see a very important aspect of this color is this intensity. You'll notice I have this intensity in addition to the RGB, and this intensity is the amount of emission it's going to give off. And I have it set not super high. So let's drag and drop that onto our cube, and we see a cube that's emitting but only on itself, and there's no glow around it. So why, when I've set that intensity, I think it should be glowing? Isn't it supposed to be emitting? Well, the emission is actually the color it emits into the environment. I haven't played around a lot with that. If we look at the normal color, you'll notice there isn't even any option for intensity. So if you don't see an option for intensity, you're not going to be able to use that color to make anything glow. It's just not going to work. So that's an important distinction. So we have our emission and it's not glowing. Why isn't it glowing? Well, there is a key element you need to add to your scene in order to make it glow. And I started just by copying the one that comes with the sample URP, but here I'll just make one from scratch. So I need to create a volume. So in this case, I have this global volume. And you'll see this profile. I don't know how, and I didn't dig into these profiles. The URP comes with a default profile, the sample scene profile. So if I select this, voila, we have glowing effect. And the reason we do is it added this bloom to it. If we uncheck this bloom, we see our glow goes away. Bloom is the amount of glow or scatter that's given off by an object. And if I select this scatter and play around with these intensities, if I up the intensity to 20, you'll see that the glow is brighter. If I set it back to 10, if I increase the scatter, you'll notice the amount of area around the element is going to increase. So let's go into our solid red glow. And if we increase the intensity, you can see it glows even brighter. And if we go back to our global volume and increase the scatter, you can see it can extend quite a bit outside of the object if that's what we want. You generally don't want it. I mean, this amount of glow is usually looks pretty good, but obviously you can play around with those values to achieve the look you want. All right, so I have a simple object glowing, right? So let's delete that guy. Oops, you know what? I deleted the wrong thing. Get that guy back. Let's delete this, which is my cube. And what we're going to do is we want a particle system where the particles glow. So let's come in here. Let's create an empty object. Let's add a particle system effect. Whoops, that's not what I want. Let's add an effect, a particle system, and it's spitting out our nice default particles. So we can come into our particle system color and we'll notice there isn't any intensity setting here. I can't make this color glow. That's not how it's set up. I can set it to red and now it's red, but it's not glowing. And I have my global volume on, but I have no intensity. So this is not going to glow. So what are we to do? Well, there is no super simple option, just like adding that global volume easily made our cube glow. What we need to do is dive into the realm of shaders. Right now, if we go into our renderer, it's using this default particles unlit material. and that material has a shader. I am assuming, I don't know, you can access it, or at least I have not figured out how to access it. So in order to get our own glowing particle, we need to make our own shader. And what we're going to do is we need to give it our own particle look. So what we'll do first is, since we have a universal pipeline, I'll go into these shaders, and I've created some for other items. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to create a new shader. And so what I'll do is I have my menu up. Now, one confusing thing, and when I watch videos, is that they like to change around the UI and the look. So sometimes what you're seeing on a video is not what you see on your screen, which can be kind of a bit frustrating, especially when you're just getting into some new area and you're just not really sure where anything is, and you're trying to follow along and you can't figure out why their screen doesn't look like yours. Your screen may not look like this if you're not using the exact version of Unity I'm using. But in this case, what is important is that we go in and we create a universal pipeline unlit shader graph. And we can change these things even after we start our shader graph. But if you're new to it, it's always nice to start with something that makes sense. And I'm going to call this glow particle shader. And I'm going to double click on it. And it popped up on my other screen. I'll drag it on here. And what we'll see is we have a couple items here. We have a vertex and a fragment. And if you're new to shaders, like I was, the vertex, you can see I can actually modify the mesh itself. Remember, a shader operates on the mesh. It is used to figure out how to create the image onto the mesh. If it's just a basic shader, a solid one, it will just apply a solid color across the whole mesh, just like our red cube. But in this case, we don't want to make a solid color. We want to make a pattern. So the fragment is where I achieved this. And you can see that by default with that unlit universal shader, all we have options to the base color. But I need to add something to the alpha. I need an alpha channel in addition to the base color. I'm not going to be using the emission right now, because remember, emission really has nothing to do with the glow. It has to do with the color, has to include that intensity. That is the key here. So I'm just going to make my screen. I'm going to drag it over here just to give us a little more room. All right, I'm going to move that up like that. I think the bottom of my screen gets cut off on these videos. So we have our elements. And so what we're going to need is a couple things. So when you're creating a shader, you can create those variables that you see when you're setting up a material come from external variables in the shader. And so what I need to do is I need to create a color component. And we'll call this glow color. And I'm going to drag it onto my screen. I'm going to default it to a color. Let's make it green. Doesn't really matter. Oops. I want it green. Click up here. And here is the key here, is that you'll notice I don't have intensity here, right? And we need that. So you'll see this mode here, this HDR. This is the key to being able to add that intensity. You'll see now I see the intensity, and I can set that for my color. And in this case, I'm just going to set it to something a little higher so we can see the glow is obvious. So I have a color that I can allow the user to set with that intensity. Now, the other thing I need is a texture. If I don't give it a texture, it'll just be a solid square, right? And we need a texture. So let's come in here and we can create a texture 2D, and we'll call it particle texture. Oh. No, I think that's right. All right, we'll drag it down here. What we're going to do is we want to see this texture. So what we're going to do is create a node, and we are going to make a sample texture 2D. All right, and we are going to feed this guy into the texture. You'll see it's solid because we haven't set the texture to any default. So what we're going to do is just use our happy default particle. You'll see there's lots of materials here because I am using that default universal render pipeline. Let's use the default particle. Yep, there's our default particle. So since we've added this element, we can allow the user of our shader to submit any particle that they want. So that's important because I may want to make a different shape particle, and this allows us to do that. So let's take this color. What we're going to do is we are going to multiply our color by our sample texture. And it's important that our sample texture is black and white because white is a full RGB, right? White is 255, 255, 255. And when we multiply that by a color, essentially what we're going to get is a colored version of our black and white input. So if this isn't black and white, when we multiply it, we're going to get some other mixture of colors. Who knows what we're going to get? Whatever those RGBs are multiplied together. Remember, anything multiplied by 1 and it is itself. So if this was green in this case, the RGB for green multiplied by all white, meaning you can look at pure white as being 1, black as being 0, essentially in this case. And when we multiply it by our color, what we're going to get is a colored version of our input. And then we can just get that to the color. So let's save this. And what we're going to do is I'm going to get my rest of my menus back. And we are going to go to our scene, and we are going to, actually what we got to do is create a material out of the shader that uses the shader that we just made. So let's go to our materials, and I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to call it glow particle material. Seems kind of obvious since it is a material, but when we look at the list, this will differentiate between my shader. So what we're going to do is we notice that there's a shader up here. This is the default Universal Render Pipeline lit shader. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the shader from the shader graph we just made, which we'll see the one we just made is glow particle. And we see our default color. That's that green, and we see our default particle. Looks like that. So instead of keeping our default particle, what I'm going to do is we're going to instead use a different particle. And I'm not going to go through this in great depth, but I made a different shape particle, and I use Inkscape. This is another open source free program. Kind of very nice for making things like this. And so what I did is I came in Inkscape and I made a polygon. That's what this outer one is. And in this case, I gave it a blur. So it's very nice in Inkscape. You can draw any object, and you can add a blur to it. So that gives us that fuzzy edge outline. And what I did is I made another solid one inside of it. So when we apply our color, the color of this inside is going to be much brighter than the outside, which was my goal. I wanted something that had some edges to it instead of just a boring round circle and a solid middle. And I saved this as a PNG. So it's got to be a PNG. That's important. Let's close this guy out. So what I have is, you can see this is my pattern that I imported as a PNG, and I just brought it in to my project as a new image. Nothing special about that. Again, it needs to be on a black background. That's important. And what we're going to do is we're going to come into our glow particle material, and I'm going to can I drag and drop? Oh yeah, I can. We're going to drag and drop our little star onto there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come into our particle system. See, it's still that red particle. And instead of using this default material, what we're going to do is we're going to use our green particle material. And, okay, we're making some progress. We have our material and it's glowing, but it's got a big black square on it. Well, that is not what we want. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of that big black square. So what we're going to do is come into our glow particle. And we'll notice that we have this alpha channel. So the alpha channel is the amount of transparency that we have. And what we're going to do is, what we want is anywhere that's black, we want it to be transparent, right? And transparency is a number between 0 and 1. This is a shape that has an RGB, but each RGB is going to be on pure white. They're going to be equal, and they're going to be something between 0 and 1. So if we take our, it doesn't really matter, let's grab our R and we feed it into the alpha channel. What it's going to do is anywhere that R is 0, which is this black part, it's going to set the alpha to 0. But there's one more thing. What we need to do is, we'll notice that our material is unlit, which is correct, but this surface is opaque. And we don't want an opaque surface, we want a transparent surface, because unless it's a transparent surface, it will not use that alpha value. And so what we're doing is we're using the alpha value as a blend. And now let's save this guy. Let's go back to our scene, and yay, we have our particle. We have a glowing particle, and we achieved it by making our own shader in order to do that. So using this, what we can do is let's play around with this and we can make some cool effects now that we got our glowing particle. So let's come into our render and let's make the particle size between 0 and 0.5, I think is fine. Let's come into our shape. Let's make it a sphere instead. Let's come into here. Let's make a higher emission. All right, lots and lots of glowing particles. Let's make a shorter lifetime. Let's increase this. We can keep our speed. That's not going to affect it. Let's even make it even shorter. Let's make it even shorter. All right. So let's do a couple more things. Our green glow material, it's a little bright. So let's tone down the brightness just a bit. It's very sensitive. Can hand edit this 1.4. There you go. I think that's good. Let's come in here. And again, we could make it any color we wanted. We could make it glowing red. We could make it glowing purple. I like this green glowing color here. And now let's go back into our particle system. What we can do is play around with some things like rotation. Always nice to see rotation. And that's why you'll notice that this star is going to look a lot better if it's rotated. If we had a plain old circle, you wouldn't even be able to see that rotation. So let's come in here and let's give it, let's make it rotate even faster. All right, and let's change the size over lifetime. Let's check that guy. Let's come down here. I'll make sure you can see this. Let's start out big. Let's make a couple different spots on our curve. What we're going to do is make it kind of pulse in and out. Give it some interest. Grab one more. And one more. All right. So that's looking pretty cool. I think that as we can see, using that pulsing in and out, it gives us kind of a popping and more of a sparkly look, right? And if we come up here and we maybe go in the emission, let's make even more, we can get a pretty good effect, right? All because that glowing really adds a lot to the effect. If we take away the glow, right? Let's come into our global volume, take away that bloom. Doesn't look nearly as cool, does it? It just takes a lot away from it, and adding that glowing bloom, really, especially for these pieces that are kind of popping up and out and as they disappear, really gives a lot better look to your effects. So what we did here is we figured out how to get our bloom going with Universal Render Pipeline, and we created a very, very basic shader. I am in no way, shape, or form an expert on shaders, just learning it myself, but there's a couple key things that you need to pay attention to. And I just noticed that on some of these really fancy shaders, they kind of go really fast and they skip over some of those keys. I know for me, I missed quite a few of those key pieces that allowed my effects to look just as good as theirs. So I hope you were able to follow along, and I hope you were able to make this cool effect, same as me, and dig into it more. And as I dig in and learn more, I'll post more of these. Again, just going over the basics of how to get some of these things working. So thanks for watching. I have lots of other really basic tutorials on how to use some of these core pieces of functionality in Unity. So subscribe to my channel and check out some of my other videos. And thanks for watching.